Emily was a pleasant and sociable young woman, just a few years older than my eldest daughter, who is 35. I had crossed paths with her several times at events hosted by the school where my wife worked. I knew she and my wife were often in contact, and I had unintentionally become aware of the drama surrounding Emily's divorce. From what I had gathered, her ex-husband epitomized selfishness and thoughtlessness. He had a well-known tendency to chase other women during his business trips, and when his infidelity came to light, he refused to accept responsibility. Instead, he blamed Emily, accusing her of not meeting his expectations in their relationship, claiming she wasn't affectionate or attractive enough, and even criticizing her for his own failings when he was home. Why am I sharing this? It's the Friday evening before the start of deer season, and instead of heading to the cabin with my wife as usual, I'm driving to pick up Emily. Nearly 12 years ago, my wife and I had the chance to purchase 20,000 acres of forest in Missouri, filled with oak and pine trees, at an excellent price. Since then, we've spent countless hours developing the property, building a small weekend cabin, creating ATV trails, and preparing food plots for wildlife. Together, we transformed it into a prime spot for deer hunting. This trip had always been a tradition my wife and I shared, but this year was different. During dinner a few weeks ago, my wife announced she wouldn't be joining me for the opening weekend of hunting season. She had been invited to participate in a series of meetings on education reform at the state capitol, which we jokingly called the Big House. While it was a great opportunity for her, it felt inconvenient for me. Normally, I would have gone hunting alone, as I had done many times before. However, after a minor heart-related health scare earlier this year, my wife insisted I shouldn't spend the weekend in the woods by myself. Despite my protests, she arranged for Emily to accompany me on her first hunting trip. Although Emily claimed to be skilled with a firearm, she had never hunted deer before. This trip also happened to fall on my birthday, which my wife would miss for the first time in years. When I arrived at Emily's house, I honked the horn briefly, something I rarely do but had been instructed to this time. The front door opened promptly, revealing Emily, who appeared weighed down by a large amount of gear. Accepting my role as her guide and companion for the weekend, I got out of the truck to help load her things. Describing Emily as talkative would be an understatement. She kept up an endless stream of conversation during the drive to the cabin. Words like cheerful, lively, and enthusiastic came to mind as she filled the car with her chatter. It was a stark contrast to the quiet and reserved personality my wife had described over the past few months. I didn't mind, though. Her energy was preferable to silence, especially considering we would be spending several hours together in a small hunting blind. We reached the cabin around 9 p.m. I immediately set to work turning on the power, water, and heating systems. Even though the temperature was expected to dip to around 50 degrees overnight, I preferred waking up in a warm cabin rather than a cold one. By 9:30, a fire was crackling in the wood stove, and warm air was circulating through the main room. Emily had already gone up to the loft, her designated sleeping area, and was busy organizing her gear for the next morning. Meanwhile, I settled into the great room, turning on the satellite receiver to catch the end of a classic war movie. "If you need to use the shower, go ahead," I called up to the loft, where I had earlier shown her the cabin's single efficient bathroom. "Certainly, go ahead," she replied. The cabin was designed for practicality, with a wood stove for heating, solar power backed up by a generator, and a unique bathroom setup. Two large sliding doors connected the bathroom to both the bedroom and the great room, allowing warm air to flow through when open, while still providing privacy when needed. I took pride in its functionality. Engrossed in the film, I was caught off guard when Emily descended the spiral staircase. Seated near the sofa, my attention shifted as she walked past, wrapped in a small towel that barely covered her. She made her way to the bathroom, the hem of the towel rising slightly with each step. She juggled soap, shampoo, and other items, nearly dropping everything as she reached the bathroom door before sliding it shut behind her. The idea that Emily could be considered unattractive seemed absurd, and I shook my head in an attempt to clear the image from my mind, refocusing on the movie. The sound of the shower starting brought unwelcome thoughts of Emily just beyond the door, and I tried to dismiss the mental image of her as she might appear. Scolding myself, I reminded myself that she was my wife's friend, and that my purpose here was to teach her about hunting, not to indulge in improper thoughts. Yet, as her soft singing drifted through the walls, it made it harder to keep my focus on the film. Eventually, the singing stopped, leaving only the steady sound of running water. I reassured myself that there was no need to worry about her running out of supplies. Thanks to the fast water heater, I had access to warm water, but I was surprised by how long she was taking. I appreciated her choice to take care of this in the evening instead of the morning and decided to shower then. While in the bathroom, I heard her voice. Soft, unmistakably happy, carrying faintly through the thin walls. As the likely situation became clear to me, my mind began racing. I chastised myself, attempting to refocus on the movie. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of running water stopped. Soon after, I could hear her humming lightly, likely as she dried off. My imagination began to wander, picturing how she might look without anything on. You're right. I'm undeniably a very passionate person, which ties to my active libido and the reality that my wife is generally uninterested. It's not entirely her fault. When the glands that produce certain hormones are removed, it's difficult to feel desire. We care deeply for one another, but the imbalance over the years has led to frequent disagreements. We're still trying to navigate this and figure out what I can do to encourage her to want intimacy more often. Once a month is frustrating, and bedtime now is primarily about rest rather than closeness or affection. Much better, she said, stepping out of the bathroom with a towel partly draped across her body as she headed toward the stairs. The towel covered her chest, another section was used to dry her damp hair, and the remaining part hung over the area between her legs, leaving her sides and back exposed. She climbed the stairs as I tried, and failed, not to watch her nearly bare figure. A part of me felt relieved when she reached the top and disappeared from sight. You know, I really appreciate your wife inviting me out here. I think I'm gonna have an amazing time, she said, descending the stairs again, now dressed in tiny navy blue shorts and a cropped white top that barely covered her. She walked past me and sat down on the sofa nearby, holding what seemed to be an empty jar of peanut butter. Tomorrow should be fun, I replied, feeling a bit uneasy. You're not usually shy, are you? If you're a woman, I could do this somewhere else, she said kindly. No, I'm not exactly shy, I replied, still unsure what she meant as she opened the jar and set the lid aside. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she removed her shirt, fully exposing her left breast. I froze, silently watching as she carefully expressed milk into the jar. Lindsay mentioned you were always very supportive of her breastfeeding your children, she said. My husband, on the other hand, found it disgusting. I nodded, still distracted by the sight of her holding her bare breast. Back then, breastfeeding was widely accepted, but nowadays society seems to be going backward, making it harder to breastfeed again. The only option I have now is to express milk at work, she added. You used to help with that too, didn't you? Yes, I assisted her with pumping as well, I replied. I had assisted her on multiple occasions, and I knew she valued it. Crystal spoke softly, leaning forward slightly to transfer more milk into the jar. I always imagined she would. I wish someone would do that for me. My husband would never consider such a thing, she murmured, placing the jar on the sofa between her knees and removing her crop top, leaving her entirely bare from the waist up. What do you mean by just this once? Are you asking me to do this for you? I want to understand, I asked, surprised. Please express some milk for me. I'm sure Lindsay wouldn't mind. It's just milk, she responded. I began to object, knowing my wife would disapprove of me touching another woman's breasts, especially a friend of hers. I'm certain Lindsay wouldn't care, Crystal insisted, picking up the jar from between her legs and leaning over my lap, her left arm resting between the arm of the sofa and my left leg, her exposed back brushing against my abdomen. You can simply reach over and handle my other side, she encouraged gently. Crystal, I started. This isn't appropriate. Oh, come on, it's harmless, she replied. You just need to extract a little milk from my breast. No, we're definitely not doing that, I muttered, stunned she would even suggest such a thing. She sighed softly and remarked how different it felt as I reluctantly squeezed her breast again. I sighed as well, silently hoping Lindsay wouldn't find out. I began carefully massaging her breast, and she commented on how strong yet tender my hands were. This feels amazing, she said. As long as you don't tell Lindsay, I replied. You can trust me. I'm sure she wouldn't care, but if it makes you feel better, I'll keep it to myself, she reassured me. It's probably for the best. She'd kill me if she found out, I muttered while continuing to squeeze her breast, filling the jar with milk. That's enough, she said softly, taking my hand off her breast. She placed it on her toned, flat stomach, just above the waistband of her shorts, as she set the jar beside me. Turning her head, she looked up at me, then shifted in my lap to face me, her chest pressing against mine. She grabbed my hand again and guided it to rest flat on her stomach, causing an unexpected reaction in me. She released my hand, then moved hers to unfasten her shorts. I heard the faint sound of the zipper descending as she slowly slid it down, the tiny teeth parting. My heart pounded. Crystal, I began, but she raised a finger to my lips. Shh, don't speak. I just want to enjoy this moment. It's been so long since anyone has touched me this way, she whispered. She gently took my wrist, pushing my hand lower while lifting one leg to rest her foot on the sofa's edge, spreading her legs and placing my hand where she wanted it. Crystal, please. Don't stop, I need this. It feels so good, she pleaded, seeking the comfort of my touch. Your hands are so gentle, yet firm. Lindsay is lucky. I found myself trapped in a complicated situation as she grasped the waistband of my sweatpants, pulling them down, leading to an intimate encounter. I sat there for a long time, staring blankly at the TV, barely noticing the movie had ended. Eventually, I turned off the lights and went to bed, putting on flannel pajamas before slipping under the covers. Morning came, or rather, the alarm's insistent beeping forced me to wake up. I shut it off, got out of bed, and shuffled into the bathroom. After finishing my usual morning routine, I returned to the bedroom to dress. Only after undressing did I remember I wasn't alone. I quickly locked both the bedroom and bathroom doors to ensure she wouldn't come upstairs unannounced. Anticipating a chilly start to the day followed by unusually warm weather, I chose lightweight thermal underwear and my usual camouflage hunting gear. Fully dressed and booted, I headed to the kitchen and called up to the loft to wake Emily. Okay, she mumbled groggily. I heard her footsteps on the stairs and turned to see her descending the spiral staircase, still rubbing the sleep from her eyes and completely nude. Her full, milk-filled breasts seemed even larger than the night before, moving with each step. She yawned and said, I'll be down for breakfast in a minute, before heading into the bathroom without closing the door. From the kitchen, my view was partially blocked as I focused on frying bacon. When she emerged, still unclothed, she grabbed a jar of peanut butter from the fridge, sat at the table, and leaned forward to express milk from her right breast into the jar. You could at least put some clothes on, I commented while flipping the bacon, frowning slightly. Don't you like seeing me naked? She asked without looking up. That's not what I meant, I replied, avoiding eye contact. You enjoy it, don't you? But about clothing, I don't wear any at home once the girls are asleep. If it truly bothers you, I can change, but it seems unnecessary. Since breakfast was almost ready, I suggested she dress warmly for the outing. If you go out like that, you'll get cold, I warned. She replied that she had plenty of warm clothes while adjusting her left breast, which now appeared fuller than the right. I removed the bacon from the stove and poured the whisked eggs into another pan to scramble. By the time the eggs were ready, she had finished her task. I was somewhat relieved when she, still unclothed, went upstairs to change. Meanwhile, I headed to the shed to prepare the ATV. Are you ready? I asked when she appeared outside the cabin about 10 minutes later. Her breath hung in the crisp morning air like tiny clouds. I think so. Gun? Check. Ammo? Check, she said with a grin. Let's go, I said as I climbed onto the ATV, securing my gear. I reached out to help her climb up. She stepped onto the footrest, swung into the seat behind me, and held her gun and pack with one hand. I took the gun from her and placed it in the second holder, then started the journey to our hunting spot, a small pond near a large food plot. The weather didn't matter, as I had built a permanent elevated blind there, spacious enough for two and originally intended for when my granddaughter was old enough to hunt with me. Crystal held on tightly for warmth as we drove through the chilly morning air at about 15 miles per hour. After roughly 100 yards from the site, I stopped to avoid scaring the deer. We'll walk from here, I said, retrieving her gun from the holder and handing it to her. How far? She asked. Just 100 yards. Driving too close might spook them, I explained. While the ATV isn't a predator, mature bucks recognize its presence and tend to steer clear. I grabbed my pack, turned off the headlights, and switched on my red headlamp. The area briefly plunged into darkness before our eyes adjusted. We followed the path to the food plot, crossed it, and climbed into the blind. The structure was basic, with 2 raised levels, a wooden floor, and metal siding and roofing. On cold mornings like this, the confined space warmed quickly from body heat as the sun rose. I designed it with dark brown walls and a roof to retain heat during chilly fall mornings. Inside, I opened the windows and we settled in to wait. I closed my eyes but wasn't fully asleep, nor entirely awake, for about 30 minutes. As dawn broke, the sky shifted from black to deep purple, then dark blue tinged with orange, and finally pale blue as sunlight reached the treetops. Conditions were perfect, and the location was excellent. All we needed now was a deer. My gun was unloaded since this trip was meant to teach Emily. It's beautiful out here, she whispered. It is, I replied softly, Now all we need is a deer. This is a great spot. I've harvested nearly a dozen deer coming to this pond for water, she murmured. For about an hour we sat quietly. Then I noticed the first movement of the day. The stillness, no wind to stir the leaves, made it easy to spot the slight motion about 100 yards away. I whispered to Emily, pointing at the deer cautiously approaching the food plot. It was a young buck with thin, spiky antlers, much smaller than those of an older deer. Younger bucks are less cautious, but if they survive long enough, they learn to avoid open fields during hunting season. How do they know it's hunting season? You might wonder. I can't explain, but they always seem to. Emily carefully raised her rifle, sliding it through the blind's front opening. She adjusted her stance multiple times to line up the shot through her scope, waiting for the buck to turn sideways. See how he's sniffing the air? He's trying to catch a scent. Predictable, I said quietly as the buck moved cautiously. A head-on shot might work, I added, but it's not worth ruining good meat by hitting the stomach. Okay, she replied softly, waiting patiently. When he turns broadside, aim just behind the shoulder and pull the trigger, I instructed. Got it, she whispered. As the buck turned slightly, exposing its side while moving toward the denser brush near the pond, I said, anytime now. All I heard was a loud click, no shot, no recoil, no smoke. Emily muttered a curse, pulled the rifle back, and worked the lever to chamber a round. By the time she aimed again, the buck had vanished into the underbrush. You didn't load your rifle when we got here? I asked, trying to mask my irritation. I thought I did, she replied with a pout. I forced myself to stay calm. He might come back, she said optimistically, setting the rifle down with a sigh. After a brief pause, she added, Oops. I sighed deeply and leaned back. For a beginner, any opportunity is valuable, I thought. We sat in silence for about 10 minutes, lost in thought, until she stood as much as the low seat allowed and began removing her jacket. Are you okay? I asked. You said it would be cold, she remarked. It's getting hot in here. It's probably over 70 degrees in here already with the sun shining. But it's not that warm outside, I said. Well, I'm not sitting out there, she replied, taking off her jacket and unlacing her boots. What are you doing? I whispered. I'm taking off these long johns. I'm roasting, she said quietly, removing her boots and carefully standing to avoid hitting her head on the metal ceiling. She unbuttoned her camouflage pants, slid her green thermal leggings down her legs, sat briefly, then stood again to push the garment over her hips and lower them entirely. I couldn't help but watch as she revealed more of her body until she sat next to me, completely nude. There, she said with a laugh, naked co-ed hunting. Yeah, I muttered, unable to look away. Will you join me? She asked suggestively. For the deer? I clarified, unsure if I understood her meaning. Yes, for the deer. No one can see us out here, and it's unlikely anyone else will show up, she replied. Undress? I asked, startled. It wouldn't be naked co-ed hunting if you didn't, she teased with a mischievous grin. I hesitated, struggling to process her suggestion. This is completely inappropriate, I muttered under my breath. Oh, not this again, she said dismissively. It's far less inappropriate than you milking me while I was lying on your lap, she countered. With a sigh, I remarked, You wouldn't want me to tell your wife about this, would you? Her eyes sparkled playfully as she smirked. It wouldn't be hard for me to convince you not to, she said. So, if I understand correctly, if I undress, you won't tell her about this? I asked, trying to clarify. That's about right, she answered, her grin unwavering. I exhaled deeply, realizing I was already in a difficult situation. What's a little more? She added cheerfully. Resigned, I began unlacing my boots. Within moments, I had shed all my clothing while Crystal tossed each piece out the window, leaving us both naked except for our boots. Now it's truly naked co-ed hunting, she said with a laugh. Indeed, I replied dryly. She stood as much as the confined space allowed, then turned and sat on my lap, her back resting against my chest and one leg draped over mine. She leaned into me, guiding my hands to her chest. I need to express some milk, and I'd prefer you do it, she stated. This is just to make me do it, she said incredulously with a shrug. As the intimacy deepened, guilt began to creep in. I realized I was betraying my wife not just once, but twice, and enjoying it. I questioned what kind of person I had become and what sort of husband I was. I think we should head back, I said suddenly, breaking the silence. That's fine, but our clothes are outside, Crystal reminded me. You threw them out the window, so I'll retrieve them, I replied with a weak laugh. It's freezing out there, she objected. If that's the price, so be it, I said firmly. After a pause, she reluctantly stood, collected our clothes, and tossed them through the door before coming back inside, shivering slightly from the cold. The interior wasn't much warmer since the door had been left ajar. She returned to my lap, curling against me for warmth. Instinctively, I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close. We stayed like that for several minutes until she whispered playfully, "If you keep doing that, you might feel compelled to love me again." "Sorry," I murmured, pulling my hands away to rest on her waist. "I'm not," she said, grabbing my hands and placing them back on her chest. "I was enjoying it. I'm just saying it's making me want you again." "That's not a good idea," I replied cautiously. "We've already crossed too many lines." "Maybe, maybe not," she said with a playful chuckle. "Let's take a shower," she suggested. "We both need one, and I'm curious if we'll both fit." I hesitated, realizing too late what she was implying. "Perfect! Let's go," she said excitedly, helping me up and leading me toward the shower. I couldn't stop wondering how I had gotten to this point and what the consequences would be. We quickly dressed, skipping underwear since it seemed unnecessary given our intentions. The silent ride back to the cabin on the ATV gave us time to reflect. When we arrived, the warmth of the wood stove greeted us as we carried our belongings inside. Crystal immediately undressed, clearly eager for more intimacy. However, instead of approaching me, she ascended the spiral staircase to the loft, calling out, "I have something for you up here." I replied affirmatively and followed her. Wearing only my boots and pants, I saw her standing by the bed, a sly smile on her face and her hands behind her back. "Here," she said as I approached, revealing a small blue envelope. I took it, turned it over, and saw my wife's handwriting on it. The initials MLH were inscribed on the front. I opened it and found a birthday card. The front read, "To my sweet, loving husband." Inside was a printed message. "If only I could find the words to describe how special you are to me. My love for you will last forever." Below that, my wife had written a personal note. "I've seen too many of our friends' marriages fall apart in their later years due to their lack of intimacy. I don't want that to happen to us. You've been so good to me in countless ways, and I refuse to lose you. Despite our disagreements, I'm confident we'll find our way back to each other. In the meantime, I want you to be happy. For your birthday, my gift to you is Crystal. Enjoy her as you wish. You have my blessing. Just promise me that your affection will be reserved for me after this weekend. One question. Did you enjoy my gift? I don't need any other details. I love you. Happy birthday. You knew about this all along?" I asked. "Of course," she said with a grin. "For weeks now." Realizing the day was far from over, I glanced at the card, shaking my head in disbelief. "Does this gift come with cake too?" I asked jokingly. "You'll have to wait and see," she teased, stepping closer and pressing her chest against mine. She leaned in for a long, sensual kiss before whispering, "Shower." "Good idea," I replied softly, still contemplating how I could ever properly thank my wife for such an extraordinary gift.